video, I want to go over my top 3 most common issues to look out for on your Subaru vehicles. We're going to start at my number 1 on the list, which will be Subaru head gasket failures. And what we have here is a 1998 Subaru EJ25D, which is the dual overhead cam, naturally aspirated 2.5 liter that came in Forester and Outback models in the late 90s. These engines, the EJ25D, were what gave Subaru its reputation for notorious head gasket failures. And this is an original factory EJ25D head gasket, and as you can see, where the head gasket failed is right here and right here. I know it's hard to give you a close-up. I'm filming with my GoPro right now, but the main problem that comes with these head gaskets and the reason they fail is because these head gaskets had this, I believe it's a graphite base coating on it. I'm not quite sure about that, but this coating around 100 to 150,000 miles would start failing, and as you can see, maybe you can see, it's peeling up right here in this corner. This is what helps seal your head gasket, and as you can see, it's flaking right off there. These 2 passages here are coolant passages. This, of course, is your combustion chamber. Coolant patches up here, and you have oil galleys spread about. But as you can see here, this is the orientation in the car. This is up, this is down. This is your lower coolant jacket around the combustion chamber. This is where the failure occurred. The coating broke down and allowed coolant to get into the combustion chamber, and that's normally how an EJ25D head gasket fails. It's normally an internal failure where coolant is getting into the combustion chamber. And as we've seen in my head gasket testing video, you will have white smoke when you start the vehicle. You will have overheating issues. You will have coolant being pushed to the reservoir and or boiling in the reservoir or pushing the coolant out of the radiator in general. You normally won't get the milkshake, the engine oil and coolant mixing together with this failure. Sometimes the oil passages can mix in with the coolant, but most of the time it's coolant to combustion where this failure occurs. And testing for that, as I showed in the other video, would be with a block tester, testing for the hydrocarbons in the cooling system, or you will do a cylinder leakage test where you put compressed air in the cylinder through the spark plug hole when the piston is top dead center and the valves are closed, and look for any air escaping, bubbling in the radiator, in the coolant, where air will be where the pressurized air will be leaking from the combustion chamber into the coolant passages and making its way to the radiator filler neck. Don't have a 25123 single overhead cam 2.5 head gasket in the shop that I can put my hands on right now. I know I've got plenty of them around, but most of the time you see the failure on those is an external leak where you have oil or coolant leaking outside between the engine block and the cylinder head. I believe I've showed that in my head gasket diagnostic video as well. Should have some clips of that, but that's pretty notorious on the later model single overhead cams. When their head gaskets fail, it's normally an external leak. Normally, you know, you'll see the leakage outside between the head and the block. You normally won't have an internal failure. If you do overheat the car, run the car low on coolant, you can have an internal failure as well, but due to age and stress and the material in the gasket, you get those external failures. I do have the new Subaru head gasket somewhere in the shop. I just can't put my hands on them at the time of making this video, but to show you the revisions made on the new head gaskets. But These old head gaskets were a multi-layer steel design, but the reason they failed was the coating. The new head gasket design is still a multi-layer steel MLS gasket, but there's a different, I don't think it's actually coated. I think it's just a different material, but it might be a coating. I'm not exactly sure. But there's different ridges, and the sealing surface here around the combustion chambers, I think it has like a copper or a brass material on it that helps seal the combustion chamber better. Normally, once you replace these older head gaskets, the original design, with the new Subaru OEM MLS head gaskets, you don't have an issue anymore. Just as long as you have your heads machined and resurfaced at a machine shop, and check the deck of the block for straightness, make sure there's no warpage or anything, and you shouldn't have any more issues with your head gaskets. Reasons that they fail otherwise, other than the originals that have these issues with the coating, failure to change your coolant at proper intervals is a big killer of the head gaskets. Subaru came out with their Subaru coolant conditioner, which is basically just a stop leak in a re-stickered, repackaged bottle. I normally don't use the coolant conditioner unless I suspect someone's head gasket's on the way out, trying to buy them some time. But that's basically all it was. It was a radiator stop leak that Subaru was putting in, trying to prolong the life of the head gaskets till they figured out the problem they were having. But yeah, change your coolant, change it on time. 30,000 miles if you got green. If you've got blue Subaru Super Coolant, which should be, if I recall correctly, 2010 or 2011 and newer Subarus, it's good. So if I remember right, I think to 100,000 miles, but I'd recommend changing it between 80 and 90,000 miles, and I can't remember the time interval. I believe it's 5 or 10 year span. I'm not exactly sure, but regular old green every 30,000 miles. Another thing that kills these head gaskets is short trips. If you do not drive your car up to full operating temperature for a good amount of time, what happens during normal operation, you don't get 100% combustion or 100% efficiency in your engine, in your cylinders. So every time an ignition cycle happens, small amounts of fuel get past your piston rings and get into the crankcase. Once that fuel gets in the crankcase, it mixes with your engine oil. Well, how the system's supposed to work is when you drive the vehicle and you drive it up to temperature, the temperature is supposed to evaporate the gasoline out of the oil, and the gasoline vapors go through the PCV system and are sucked into the engine and burned. When people do a lot of idling in traffic, a lot of city driving, or a lot of short trips, your engine doesn't fully get up to temperature and the oil doesn't get hot enough to get that fuel out of the oil. And that fuel in the oil is, like you can use fuel for a cleaner. It's like a varnish. It hurts the lubricity of the oil, and that can have an effect on the head gasket as the oil is going through the oil passages with that fuel in it. It can hurting the head gasket, causing early failure. So short trips, not changing your oil enough, and not changing your coolant enough are the main killers of Subaru head gaskets. But that's number one on the list. Number one thing that everyone knows about Subaru: head gasket failure, head gasket issues. Number two on the list of common Subaru failures are wheel bearings. Most the early Subarus had a press-in wheel bearing design. You pressed your wheel bearing as an assembly. Let me get this old wheel bearing out of this box to give you a better look. You have this center section here, and you have a race on either side where your bearings, it's a dual bearing setup ride. It's basically packaged as a cartridge, and as you've seen in the wheel bearing replacement videos, this cartridge, this is all deformed due to the seal when I removed them from the car before. But there we go. You have your bearing, one on each side. It rides inside of the center section. But one on each side, and it comes packaged from Subaru as a cartridge, essentially. You have a plastic piece in the center here that holds all three pieces together, and you press this cartridge wheel bearing into your spindle. You secure it on the back side with a snap ring. You put your seals in to keep grit and dirt and water from getting into the bearing and wiping out your grease. And then you will take your wheel hub and you press it through the bearing from the outside of the spindle, and you're all set. Insert your CV axle through the hub, torque your CV axle nut, and it sets the preload on the bearings. The issue here with the Subaru wheel bearings, from what I've gathered from time in the community, basically, the issue is that the wheel bearings basically weren't stout enough for the cars. They weren't properly big enough for the weight of the car with all-wheel drive system with the 4 axles going through all 4 hubs. But the main issue is the wheel bearings are prone to failure. They're a non-serviceable unit. You can't pull them apart and re-grease them. Basically, once they're shot, they're shot. Press them out, press a new one in. New grease and oil seal, dirt seals, and good to go. Normally when you have a wheel bearing fail, you need to replace your hub. As you can see on this hub, there is some roughness on the surface where the hub rides inside of the wheel bearing, and when the bearing gets rough spots, bad, worn, essentially, this hub can slightly turn inside of the bearing and cause friction and wear into the hub, and it won't fit as tightly as it's supposed to inside the wheel bearing. So most of the time when your wheel bearings fail on the older design press ends, you need to replace your wheel hub. From 2005 to basically now, most every Subaru model has a bolt-in wheel bearing assembly. It's no longer the press together multiple pieces. You have your hub, bearing, and it's basically mounted on a plate, and you have 4 bolts that attach it to your spindle rather than pressing it into the spindle and securing it with a snap ring and then pressing in your hub. But number 2 on the list is wheel bearings and wheel bearing failures. And number 3 on the list, alternators. Subarus have had alternator issues for quite some time. Mostly on the modern Subarus, it seems to be not as big as an issue as it was on the older models. Subarus kind of go through alternators pretty commonly. I know personally, my car, I went through several alternators within a short period of time. The OEM alternator is fairly robust on the 3 liters, but I strongly advise staying away from aftermarket or remanufactured alternators. I've had nothing but issues with the remans on these vehicles. I don't know if it's just they're not built up to standards or using subpar components, or just whoever's doing the manufacturing is doing a shoddy job. I don't know. I'm pretty sure it's mainly a culmination of the cheap components and the shoddy work with the reman units. But they don't last anywhere near as long as the OEM units do. I think the main issue on Subaru alternator longevity is that the alternators aren't quite up to the task of running all of the electric loads of the car. They if you have the older through the 90s Subaru models, A lot of times, if you've got your headlights on, you're driving at night, you got the radio on, got the air conditioning on, you know, fair amount of accessories on, and you come to a stoplight or stop sign and put a turn signal on, you can kind of see your dash lights dimming every time that turn signal comes on. I know I've seen it in several of my Subarus over the years. It's just these alternators can't quite keep up with the demand, is all I can figure. I'm not exactly sure if it's 100% the alternator's fault or if it's the wiring to the alternator and the battery aren't quite up to the gauge they need to be. I've seen in some of the forums and things that people have upgraded the wiring to the alternator, to the battery, grounds, things like that, and have improved the charging system on the vehicles. But the main thing I've seen to improve the issue is upgrading the alternator completely. I know that there's a few companies that make higher amperage alternators in the aftermarket. I can't recall the company's name, but if I can, in editing this video, remember who it was, I will try to put a link or mention the name or the product. But I have seen that a lot of the 6-owner guys, especially with the early EZ30Ds, do upgrade to a higher amperage alternator. But yeah, alternators, a lot of times it's the electrical components in them that fail and they just simply stop charging. Sometimes, you know, you've got bearing issues, you've got the nose bearing will go out, or your tail bearing will go out, or brushes are worn, or you know, your regulator goes out, or really bad bearings here. But I have a collection. I've got probably about 15 alternators around the shop sitting up here, all Subarus. And as you can see, I can just keep piling them in here. I've got plenty of them scattered all around. There's 5 right there. The biggest improvement I've found personally for longevity of your alternator after it's died, your OEM, rather than going and buying a reman alternator or going and spending about $400-ish for another OEM alternator. If you've seen my old video, it's an old video on the SVX alternator where I do a rebuild on it. I'll try to find the website and products and try to link it somewhere in the description of the video. But I've had way better luck in rebuilding my own alternators for my Subaru vehicles, just in replacing the regulators. And yeah, rebuilding has definitely given me longer service life on the alternators than going and completely outright replacing with a reman unit, because like I said, the remans, I haven't had any luck with them lasting any given amount of time before crapping out again. They normally, I can get normally they last just as long as they're warranted for, and after that you're out of luck. But yeah, rebuilding your alternators is not that hard, actually. You've only have a few bolts to remove around the outside, pull the casings apart, a few tabs to solder back in, your brushes are held in place, you pull your pin once you've got it all back in there. But I'll link SVX alternator rebuild video, and I'll probably have some clips up of the rebuild going on while I'm sitting here babbling on. But yeah, number 3 on the list, Subaru alternators. But yeah, that concludes the video. Top 3 things to know, to look out for, top 3 failures to look out for in your Subaru vehicles: head gaskets, wheel bearings, and alternators. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.